My people, we're ready to mount up like an eagle. Stand and fight against evil. A system rigged and deceitful. King.
What's good, and welcome to the King Talks podcast, where we're all about the truth, community, and discussing the things you care about. I am your host, Sean Slaughter, and on today's show, we interview Dr. Vince Bantu. Dr. Bantu is a professor at Meacham Theological Institute. He holds an MA and PhD in Semitic and Egyptian languages from the Catholic University of America, an MDiv from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary Center for Urban Ministerial Education, a THM from Princeton's Theological Seminary, and a BA in Theology from Wheaton College. His primary interests include theological contextualization, racial reconciliation, early Christianity in Africa and Asia, and theological education in under-resourced communities. Today, we're going to talk about, is Christianity the white man's religion? Let's go.
My people, we're ready to mount up like an eagle. Stand and fight against evil. A system rigged and deceitful. King, you can hear it when I rhyme. I'm a king, renewed in my mind. I'm a king, I got a different bloodline. I'm a king, jump, I am a king. I'm a king.
What's good? Welcome to the King Talks podcast, where we're all about the truth, community, and discussing the things you care about. I'm your host, Sean Slaughter, and on today's show, I definitely have the privilege and honor of interviewing Dr. Vince Bantu. Dr. Bantu, how are you today?
Hey, what's up, Brother Sean? It's good to be here, man.
No doubt, man. And I know you're just fresh off of teaching, so I definitely appreciate that. Just to kind of run down your credentials, Dr. Bantu, you've been in school for a long time, brother.
Long.
You've been in school for a long time. You have an MA and a PhD in Semitic and Egyptian language, a THM in church history. You have an a master in divinity, a bachelor's in theology. What drove you to go to school for this long? I mean, most people get out of high school. They may get their bachelor's, they may get their master's degree. But what was the driving force? And particularly, I see the theology there. I see the Master of Divinity, and I know, I'll ask you a little bit about, you've done some pastoring, but then you make this turn at Princeton Theological Seminary towards church history, and then you make these two other turns towards Semitic and Egyptian language. What happened?
Yeah, man. I feel you, man. Like, I mean, at the jump, man. I mean, I've been a believer, man. I accepted the Lord Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, man, when I was like 8 years old, man. I was growing up in the hood in West St. Louis, man, and Pops wasn't around. Things was going on in my neighborhood, man, and I heard the gospel, man, and that was just like a message of hope and redemption for me in situations of hardship, man. And like, Jesus has been my cornerstone, my bedrock since day one, man. And I've had a passion for the gospel, man, sharing the gospel. But man, I just really wrestled, man. Even back in like high school days, man, I would try to like bring my homies, with me to church, and I was like the only one. I was always the only one, like, or it felt like it, man. And like, and I didn't realize it until I got grown, that the way that like church was done, as much as I love my church and I love the church, it just wasn't relevant for my homies. And like, really, that's still the case for a lot of cats in the hood, where the way church is presented is not relevant. And so people can't, and even I felt like I had to kind of give up a lot of who I was as a brother from West St. Louis in order to be a good Christian, so to speak. And so I felt a call to ministry, though, and I had this passion for studying the Word. So I was like, man, all right, the Lord's calling me to ministry, but I got to study. I got to get, really understand His Word. So the Lord. I mean, I wasn't even thinking about college, man. Nobody in my family went to college. Like, that wasn't ever new on the horizon. But it was only because I felt called to ministry that it was my passion for wanting to be prepared for ministry that made me want to go to school, period. And so I went to, like you said, man, went to study theology. And I didn't even know what seminary was. I heard that. I was like, okay, I'm going to go to seminary, and I did that too. But as I was studying theology, man, and I was just, really, I think it started to come together and click why my homies growing up weren't able to jive with Christianity. The more I was learning the history and the more I would learn theology, I would be presented with how westernized and how whitewashed it was, man. I would go and study theology at top Christian schools, and I would not see myself reflected. I would not see my community reflected. I was basically taught this white, Western, Eurocentric theology, and I was like, man, this is why my homies couldn't rock with Christianity, and this is why a lot of people in my community still can't rock with Christianity, because the way it's being presented. And I was like, man, this is crazy. What are we going to do about this? Like, did this whole thing come from white folks? Like, did all this come from, like, the Martin Luthers and John Calvins and the slave owners like Jonathan Edwards and the slave supporters like Charles Hodge and all this kind of stuff? And, where are we at in this whole story? Like, is the beginning of it slavery? And then, man, when I was in seminary, like that term you mentioned, man, was when I was in seminary, I took a class on African church history, and it was in Egypt, and that was eye-opening, man, because I was like, wow, I had no idea that Christianity has been on the continent of Africa among African people since the very beginning. And I was like, bro, I've been in Christian colleges, I've been in seminaries, they never told me none of that stuff. They only told me European Western church history. They didn't tell me none of that stuff. And I was like, bro, if like more people knew about that, then maybe we would be able to change the narrative on what this whole thing is. So that was when I was like, man, I got to go get a PhD in that. And so I can share that knowledge with my community and with the world, man, for real.
Okay, so all right, this is beautiful because you're setting everything up. All right, you're putting the ball on the golf tee. All right, so let's talk about you went to go study. You went to Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You went to Egypt to go study, and you basically went to Egyptian seminary. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no. So it was when I was doing my Master of Divinity at Gordon Conwell Seminary that and I was at their Center for Urban Ministry, and that was what was really dope because it was like a diverse student body, faculty, and curriculum. And so I took that class and went to Egypt, but it was through that seminary. And then when I went to get my PhD, it was at the Catholic University of America, which is in Washington, D.C., and it was at that place where I was able to study Coptic literature and this and that. But I did actually have the opportunity to teach at an Egyptian seminary. I was teaching at the Alexandrian School of Theology, which is over in Cairo, Egypt. And that was kind of a dope thing, man. That was just a few years ago. And it was crazy, man, because it was literally 10 years after I took that first trip when I first went to Egypt for the first time as a student. And I was learning. I first got hit to all this stuff. It was literally, that was 2006 when I first went. And then it was 2016, just a few years ago, when I came. I just finished my PhD, and I came back, and it was crazy. It was like a full circle, man, because it was 10 years later. And now, 10 years later, I got, went from getting introduced to African church history to now having got the PhD in it. And now I'm coming back to Egypt and sharing with Egyptian Christians, man. It was crazy. Like it was such an honor and a humbling thing, man, to be teaching Egyptians who themselves were Christian. Some of them even were like, kind of like low-key Christians because they was in Muslim families and Muslim backgrounds, and they was threatened with persecution. And like I was teaching them, man, about their own. They didn't even know about their own history, man. That's the crazy thing is when I've gone to the Caribbean and I've gone to Africa, man. I just taught pastors in Senegal, man, last year, and they were even saying, man, we had no idea about the church in like Ethiopia, Nubia, all that early African. They even brothers on the continent and sisters on the continent don't even know because again, man,
why is that?
The perception is global that it's a white man's religion.
Why is that? Why in Egypt? Why in the Caribbean? Okay, we understand and we'll get into it, but we understand the whitewashing of religion. And I'm gonna have you talk about identity politics in a little bit. But why when you go back to these places, does it seem like their history has been whitewashed? You would think it's untouched because it's not American or at the very least, well, I guess it's maybe European, but why are they so ignorant to kind of some of their own past, their own Christian past? Why is that?
Man, it's because, man, like my good friend and mentor, man, Dr. Soong Cham Ra, he's a professor at North Park Seminary in Chicago, and he has a book called The Next Evangelicalism. And in that book, he uses this phrase over and over. It's called the Western white cultural captivity of the church. And what he means by that, and to your point about identity politics, is what he means by that is that even though we know Christianity is a religion for all people, that the Bible itself says that salvation came first through the Jews and first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles. And there's no ethnocentrism in the gospel. It's for everybody. Yeah. And we can all come to Jesus as we are. We know that's what the book says. We know that's what God's word says. And so, but yet, even despite the fact that the gospel is for all people, and you don't have to be Jewish, you don't have to be white, you don't have to be black, you don't have to be Chinese, everybody can be who they are. In Revelation 7:9, all tribes, all tongues. That means that all of us are still going to be different, even in heaven. That we will still speak Spanish and Chinese and Japanese and Congolese and every other kind of language. We will still have our differences in heaven, just like God eternally exists as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, distinct and yet unified eternally. And that's how he made us as a reflection. That's how we bear his image. But even despite that being the reality, the perception is still that Christianity is the white man's religion. And the crazy thing is that is not just a perception that persists in America among black people, but it's also something that's a big deal for Native Americans, because that Christianity for them represents the religion that pushed them off of their land on the Trail of Tears and put them on reservations, and where they were forced to assimilate and become white. But not only in America, but all over the world. Like you go like you said, man, to the continent. I mean, when Christians came in on them boats, and they brought a lot of us over to the U.S. They also brought us to the Caribbean and to South America, but a lot of them stayed there and colonized Africa. And missionaries a lot of times would come along right alongside them and be bringing the gospel, and sometimes they would try to fight back against the colonialism. Sometimes they would participate in it, but either way, the Christianity, even on most of the continent, was so much associated with white European colonialism. And even to your point about Egypt, Egypt got to the point where the Christians there became persecuted. Not even before it became a predominantly Muslim country, they were being persecuted by Roman Christians because they weren't the kind of Christian that the Romans were. And so even going back to ancient times, you had problems of the dominant culture. The way they do church is the only right way to do church, and the way Africans do it is the wrong way because it's the way they do it. And so they were persecuted. They weren't able to spread, and it left them open to being conquered by Muslims, to the point to where now even over there, that is still the case where they're the minority. And so the history isn't taught as much. It's not as prominent. And sometimes people may not even, know the history. And that's the crazy, just global nature, man. I got friends that are missionaries in China, and even over in China or in Japan, they'll say, people will be like, oh, Christianity, that's the white religion. That's the Western religion. That's not, that's incompatible with our culture. And so that perception is global. It's crazy, man.
And I think in one of your videos you called that the Western captivity of the church, where it was
exactly
where Christianity was basically it was co-opted. In order to I guess bring forth whatever other things. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit? How it was co-opted? Talk about Constantine a little bit, and
for sure.
Yeah, how the legalization of Christianity and here's what's funny, Dr. Bantu. You would think that, and of course it's hard to put ourselves back at that time, but you would think that with our, quote unquote president, or, the leader of the country, after years and decades and centuries of persecution, you would think that finally a leader, he's not our leader necessarily, but foreign leader, he finally recognizes our religion. He finally recognizes our God. You would think that would be a good thing. And it kind of led us to where we are right now. Can you maybe talk about, just that process of Constantine really taking Christianity and making it the main religion?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the analogy I love to use about what happened is like rock and roll music, right? I mean, if you Google rock and roll music, or if you just look up images of rock and roll music, and you look at, and if somebody didn't know their history and just looked up, okay, and they weren't familiar with it, and they just look, okay, what is rock and roll music? I don't even know what that is. They would be inundated with images of Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash and all of these white people and all of these like 50s and 60s TV shows of white teenagers dancing to rock and roll. They would think, oh, okay, rock and roll was a bit about white people. But again, they may not realize, because the history is often suppressed, that actually rock and roll was invented by black people. But because white folks had more money, they had more producers, and I mean, you as a musician would know better about this than me, they had the ability to co-opt rock and roll to the point to where black artists were eclipsed, and they were overshadowed by the much more wealthy and prominent white musicians that kind of co-opted that art form, even though originally it was a black art form. And that's exactly what happened with Christianity. Christianity began with a bunch of brown-skinned, Middle Eastern, Palestinian, Aramaic-speaking Jews like Jesus and all of his disciples and apostles, but then it quickly went out to other brown-skinned, Middle Eastern and North African and white Europeans who were all gathered together at Acts 2 at Pentecost. And so at the very beginning, the prophecy was fulfilled that through Abraham's seed, all seed will be blessed, and that again, the gospel's for all people. But like you said, it got co-opted. Now, for the first 3 centuries of Christianity was going all over the ancient world. It was going into Asia. It went into Persia. Even before Constantine became a Christian, the Roman emperor, even 10 years before that, the king of Armenia, which is a Middle Eastern country, they became a Christian nation before Constantine did, and they adopted Christianity as their national religion, and that's still a Christian country to this day. It's like 99% Christian. But they have their own tradition of Christianity. And it was going into the Persian Empire. It went to India. Christianity was in India, like the subcontinent of India, already no later than the 3rd century before the time of Constantine. It was in the Arabian Peninsula. Christianity was in Arabia, like hundreds of years before the Prophet Muhammad even lived. Christianity was in Egypt. It was in North Africa. It was in Ethiopia. It was in Nubia or Kush. It was in Europe too. It was in modern-day Greece and Italy and France and all that. So it was going everywhere. And Christianity was not considered to be associated with any one people group. Like today we think of Judaism, you think of Jews. Like you think of Hinduism, you think of Indian people. That's that identity politics. But back then, again, now, because of how the enemy has worked into things and white supremacy, now people, when they hear Christian, they think white people. They think Western people. They think imperial colonialists, right? But in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, you say Christian, you don't think of any one culture, because Christians was Indian, they was Ethiopian, they was Greek, they was Persian, it was a whole multi-ethnic thing. But what happened was when Constantine allegedly became a Christian. First of all, he was a heretical Christian who was an Arian, which didn't even believe that Jesus was God. But when he allegedly became a Christian, and what had happened was, and like you mentioned, we still have this dynamic going on today in our country where we have I would call implicated Christianity, an imperial Christianity that believes that it is our goal as Christians to be in bed with and to be supporting the empire, the desires and the interests of the empire, and we are the idea is that we are supposed to have a Christian emperor at the helm of things who can kind of do our job for us as the church, and whatever our emperor and our empire's will is must be the will of God. That kind of thinking was inconceivable to a Christian in the New Testament who remember Jesus' words that said, if they hate me, they will hate you, and that we foxes have holes, and that we are to be pilgrims in this land. We're supposed to be in the world and not of it. And even any Christian for the first 3 centuries would have never even thought, oh, we're going to try to have a Christian empire, a Christian nation, all that kind of stuff, that we are the light, we are the salt of the world, we're the light of the world. But as soon as Constantine became a Christian, then the Christians in the Roman Empire got it in their mind that, oh, we have a Christian emperor now. He's on our side. And I'm not totally hating on them, because Christians up until that time, in fact, right before Constantine, they were being severely persecuted by Emperor Diocletian. And so I can understand why they would be like, well, now we got a Christian emperor who's on our side, who's actually going to flip the tables. Now he's going to persecute the pagans, the Roman traditional religion, and he's going to support Christians. He's going to build us big old cathedrals. And so they began to adopt a lot of Roman culture, and theology became articulated, and orthodoxy became seen to be only communicated through Greco-Roman terminology, and the church started to mirror Roman political structures, and the architecture of churches mirrored the architecture of Roman political buildings, and Christianity became very Romanized in the Roman Empire. But let's not forget, as I mentioned before, there was already Christians in other parts of the world outside of the Roman Empire. But the problem is that when Constantine and not just Constantine, but the Christians in the Roman Empire began to see Christianity as a Roman religion, then that made things difficult for Christians in other places. So Christians in the Persian Empire, for example, now they were forced to have to choose, well, am I going to be a Christian or am I going to be a Persian? But again, before this time, they didn't have to answer that question. There was no sense of like, oh, being a Persian and being a Christian are antithetical to each other. But now that Christianity was seen as the Roman or the Western or the white religion, now they had to decide. And the Persian emperor began to tell them, you're going to choose. You're going to be a Persian or you're going to be a Christian. And if you choose Christian, we're going to kill you. And so Christians then either began to renounce faith or they said, you know what, I'm not denouncing Jesus Christ. And some of them even went to their death saying, I just wanted to be clear. I love the Persian Empire, and I love the Persian Emperor. I'm loyal to my country. I'm only being killed today because I'm a Christian, not because I'm a traitor. But that was the seed in the 4th century that laid the groundwork for the same problem that we are still dealing with now. That for people who are non-white, non-Western, whether they're Asian or Middle Eastern or Native American or African on the continent or in the diaspora, many of us are made to feel that we have to choose between being who we are as Black or Middle Eastern or Asian or whatever. We have to choose between our cultural identity or identity as a Christian. And the reason that we struggle with that is because of that Western white cultural captivity of the church that started in the 4th century during that time of Constantine.
And I think what's a couple things that you said are just so powerful. You talk, and what you're talking about, and I know this happened really close to the 1500s, but you talked about Christianity being the white man's religion was the process of the Western Christian enterprise, right? Which I think it was so powerful when you said that, and you said it didn't happen overnight. You know, it happened over a long period of time. Probably its starting point really was here. And then working its way. But one of the things you said is before we had that Western Christian enterprise, and that was started by really Constantine by saying this is Christianity and everything else is not. This whole idea of when you were talking about in your video, flavors came to mind. Christianity seemed to have different flavors during the early church. The Hellenized Roman Christianity, the Aramaic Christianity, the Syriac, the Syrian flavored Christianity, and everything was okay. Would you compare those to denominations today?
I would say there's some similarities and some differences. Like, I would compare it, more to cultures today. For example, you can talk about the Black church and you can talk about the Black Christian experience, but we know that the Black church or Black Christians as a whole group are many denominations. And some of those denominations have white counterparts. Like there's Black Baptists and white Baptists and Black Methodists and white Methodists and so on and so forth. But yet at the same time, across culture, there's certain similarities. Like, for example, there's some things that a Black Baptist and a Black Methodist might have in common with each other that they may not have in common with a white counterpart of their same denomination. And then vice versa, there's some things that are denominational. And I would say the same thing was in the ancient church too. Like the Syriac language or the Syriac culture was a culture. And the Coptic or the Ethiopian, these were all different cultures. But within those cultures, they also had different denominations too. And sometimes those identities, those theological or / denominational and those cultural or linguistic identities would sometimes overlap and overlay. And so you would have, for example, a quote-unquote Catholic or Chalcedonian Christian who is in the Syriac-speaking world, and then one who's in the Coptic world, and then one in the Greek world, but they were all in the same denomination. But then they would have members of their culture, fellow Syriac or fellow Coptic speakers or fellow Ethiopians, who would be in a different denomination, who would maybe instead of being Catholic or Chalcedonian would be what the Western people call Monophysite or Miaphysite, what they call themselves, the people who believed in one nature in Christ. They were totally separate denominations. So I would say that there was kind of like an overlap, and there was kind of, it's just like today too. when you get into theological / denominational identity, and then when you get into cultural, ethnic, linguistic identity, those things can kind of begin to overlap and overlay in different ways in modern times and in the ancient world as well.
And can they both coexist? You said it earlier. Some people feel like they have to either follow Jesus or be who they are culturally. And I remember hearing probably more than one time, but in particular, this is probably within the last 2 or 3 years, it became popular on Instagram, where this one black preacher said, I'm neither black or white, I'm Christian. And it gets right to the heart of some people feel like they have to either follow Jesus, like your boys. I got to either follow Jesus and give up my culture. Now, obviously, there's things that we give up for the Lord, right? You can't you can't go before the Lord with sin. But there are certain things specifically culturally that are not sinful. They're just part of that culture. Do you feel that people can have Jesus and their culture too? Is that something that you feel?
I mean, most definitely. And I would say that usually, with no shade, like when people say that, I think that it represents a, let me say, naive understanding of what culture is. I mean, to say that I can reject my culture is like saying I can reject my gender. Like, I cannot reject the fact that God has made us man and woman, and that being a man or being a woman, it affects everything about how you see the world and how other people experience and treat you. And we would never say, well, I need to be a Christian or be a man, or I need to be a Christian or be a woman. You be both. God made you a man. He made you a woman. And those things come with certain kind of, specificities. And they both equally represent the image of God. And so God did not make us male and female in his image for us to ignore it or say, oh, forget about it. And in the same way, what the theologians call the cultural mandate, when he created Adam and Eve, he said, fill the earth and subdue it, or cultivate it, or play with it. A lot of people understand it to be the cultural mandate that God intended for them to spread out. He said, fill the earth, populate it with people, and then cultivate it, create culture. God intended for us to be different from the get-go, from jump. And even people will say, oh, well, cultural difference came in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel, and it was a curse, blah, blah. But a lot of these people aren't understanding and reading that a chapter before in Genesis 10, you already had the Table of Nations where you had all these different ethnic groups, all these different nations that were spreading out. And the problem in Genesis 11 was not diversity. In fact, diversity was God's solution to the problem of homogeneity because they all had one language and one culture, and they were trying to stay together in one place and they were being disobedient to God. When God told them to fill the earth and subdue it, they said, no, we're going to stay here. We're going to build a tower. We're going to build a city where it's safe. We don't have to go out there in the wilderness where we might get hurt. And they're disobeying God. But God said, all right, y'all ain't going to spread out like I told you to? Boom. You can't even understand each other no more. Now you're going to spread out. I'm going to make you spread out and be diverse the way I always intended you to be. That's not a punishment. That is God pushing humanity into the destiny he made for us, which Abraham was the fulfillment of in the next chapter when he went out and trusted God against all fear and human suspicion. But again, we see the fulfillment of that eschatologically in Revelation 7, which we mentioned, and even before that in Acts 2, where again you have all nations, all tribes, all tongues gathered before God. Only this time, instead of trying to build a tower up to God to reach God up in heaven, God comes down and fills us up with his Holy Spirit. He meets us. But when God fills the believers at Pentecost with his Holy Spirit, you hear every tongue. When God's Spirit falls, diversity is expressed and enriched. Yeah. It's not ignored. It's not put to the side. And again, in Revelation 7, John saw a multitude that was every nation, tribe, and tongue. Culture, it can be a beautiful thing. Now, again, yes, of course, because of sin has gotten into culture, like you said. And so all of our cultures have lots of sin in them. Our culture in particular has sin in them. There's nothing that breaks my heart more when I'm walking around in the hood in my culture, in our community, and I see people fighting or I see violence happen, and then I see people find it funny. When I see somebody laughing at violence or picking their phone up to take a video of violence, that is a part of our culture that I will just come out and say is wrong. It is broken and sinful, and there is no redemption of that. That just needs to go. A Christian in our culture, in the hood, cannot engage in that culture, in that aspect of our culture. But, I mean, wearing a do-rag in church, or hip hop music that's worshiping Jesus, that's glorifying Jesus Christ, or hooping or whatever. Like, there's so many other parts of our culture as well that can be glorifying to God, and we don't throw the baby out the bathwater. And again, the naivete is the idea that, if I'm going to throw my culture out, whatever you throw it out, you're going to pick up something else, because it's how God has wired us. We think and act in cultural ways. All of us are culturally bound. Culture is this is getting a little anthropological, but culture is the system of the shared system of interpretation of symbols and meaning. It's the way that we ascribe meaning to different behavior. It's the way that we understand and codify human behavior. And all of us have a particular culture. None of us can step out of our culture. All of us have a culture. And again, because of God's image, all of our cultures have beauty in them. And because of sin, all of our culture have wickedness in them. And it's the job of the Christian to in Matthew 28, make disciples of all ethne. We are supposed to disciple our ethnicity. We are supposed to disciple our very cultures. And within all of us, within our culture, we have to be the ones to say, you know what, this part of our culture is really not good. And we as Christians, we just need to come away from that, and we have to change. And we have to adopt biblical ways of doing things. But you know what? This part of our culture is actually a very good and beautiful thing, and it actually can glorify God, and we can magnify God. God can be seen through our culture in this particular way. And when we all unite as one body, you have all these different ways and artistic and musical and cultural ways of glorifying God, and they're all distinct, but they're all unified in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's the beauty of it. That's the goal that we should be reaching, not to either make an idol of culture, but also not to try to act like we're going to ignore culture, because that's not what God calls us to do, but to embrace it, to transform it, and then use it as a mechanism of glorifying God.
Man, that's good. I think whenever we talk about culture, it reminds me of Lecrae. And you familiar with Lecrae?
Oh yeah, that's my boy. That's my dog. That's the dude right there.
So, and when Lecrae basically made a statement where he felt that in his he felt like he was being used by evangelicals, just to kind of put it bluntly. But he in his own way, because you can't be cultureless, right? If you're putting down one culture, you're picking up another, and they both are blessed and they both are sinful, right? So to say one culture is better than the other culture, they both have their pluses and their minuses. And he came to the realization, and I think he came to this realization because of the things that were happening in his community, whether it was police brutality, or whether it was violence, or whether it was abortion, or whatever the things that were happening. He was saying, it's funny, I'm in these churches, but the issues in my community and my culture never being addressed. Homosexuality is talked about, abortion is talked about, but social justice is not being talked about. And I think it became an awakening for him, where he realized, I can still embrace aspects of my culture, the music, the dress, the language. There's certain aspects of my culture, misogyny, hypersexualization, hypermasculinity. There's certain things that are in my culture I just have to reject. And a lot of people came at him for that, because I think they were more. I think they did the same thing that he did. They rejected a certain aspect of culture, because just like what Constantine did, this is this type of practicing Christianity is the better type of Christianity. You know what I'm saying? Versus your flavor of Christianity. And I think a lot of people buy into that today. But I want to talk. I want you to talk a little bit about. And man, I found this so powerful, man. I mean, just so. And so free, man. I've been on this journey, Dr. Bantu, of I feel like my Christianity journey is the same as my educational journey. And what I mean is, in an alternative school, I deal with 99% black boys. And one of the things that I try to do in school is to remove the whitewashing of education and show them themselves in American history. You know what I'm saying? And say, not only were we just little figures at, little important parts of history, we were the foundation of American history, and here's where we are. And I think you've done this in Christianity, where you went back and you really dug into ancient African Christianity and kind of revealed some things. Can you talk a little bit about Christianity and ancient African in ancient Africa and what that looked like?
Oh yeah, man. Like, and again, I'm glad you brought that up too, because that's one of the most freeing things about, kind of my main area of study is the fact that, this is one of as a black theologian, as a black scholar of theology, biblical theological studies, it sometimes can be, a little disheartening that so much of what we write, if you just Google black theology or black theological works by a lot of scholars, a lot of times a lot of it is good and necessary, but so much of it, like the overwhelming majority of it, is like kind of deconstructing and talking about kind of like what we were talking about earlier, and you have to do that, like kind of naming and deconstructing like white hegemonic supremacist type of Christianity in the way that's been expressed and kind of presented as normative and normatizing, and like all that kind of stuff. And we got to deconstruct that. But then it's like, okay, what else are we other than a response to whiteness? You know what I'm saying? Like, who are we?
That's good.
What is our identity apart from just critiquing? Yeah. And that's the beautiful thing about studying early African Christianity is the fact that these Christian traditions pre-exist. That kind of Eurocentric or Western-centric Christianity, because even before Constantine, like you said, it was a long process that started in the 4th century. But even before that process started, Christianity was already in the continent of Africa as well as Asia. But it was in Egypt and North Africa from the beginning, and we have some of the earliest biblical fragments from the country of Egypt that came out of Egypt in the mid-2nd century, in the 100s. And then also some of the earliest theologians from North Africa, like Tertullian, who was from Carthage, which was the Roman province called Africa before the whole continent, the whole that we now know as Africa. It was that small region that we now call Tunisia, where Tertullian was from, who was one of the first theologians to use the word Trinity, and he was one of the most well-written, widely written theologians, and first one to write in the Latin language. And he was a North African Berber, so to speak, or Imaziran, as they call themselves today in Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco. And also you had Perpetua and Felicity, who were martyrs for the Christian faith, who were put to death in the Roman Colosseum. So again, like Romans was in the 200s when Perpetua and Felicity lived, two Imaziran or Berber North African Christian women who lived right around the year 200, but they were killed. These were North African Imaziran Christian women who were put to death for their faith in Jesus Christ. And who were they killed by? They were killed by Roman pagans. The white folks, the Europeans for the pagans. They were killing African Christians. African Christians was dying for the faith over in Egypt too. And you had Christians in Egypt who were some of the earliest theologians like Origen and Clement of Alexandria. You had one of the first seminaries, the Alexandrian Catechetical School. And also you had an organized church hierarchy. Bishop Demetrius in the 100s, was organized and really solidified Egyptian Christianity. And then in the 200s, you have Pachomius. Pachomius is the first Egyptian to write in the Coptic language. And so that's when Christianity begins to be expressed not just in Greek, but also in the native Egyptian language called Coptic. And Pachomius, or Pahom, which is a Coptic name, Egyptian name, he was the founder. He was really one of the first major figures in monasticism, and in Egypt, then later in Kush or Nubia, as well as Ethiopia, monasticism was all over, and all, especially along the Nile Valley, Christians, the gospel message spread, especially through the monks and the monastic. Again, the monks, they lived in community in the desert. They were empowering poor people. In fact, that was one of the homies. If you read his biography, that was one of the main things that attracted him to Christianity. Was how, this is crazy. Imagine this. In Pachomius' day, this is in Upper Egypt. So this is a bunch of dark brown skin, African, Egyptian, Coptic-speaking people up in the Upper Nile Valley, which is in southern Egypt. And Pachomius, in his context, he was a pagan. He worshipped the Egyptian gods. So this is what a lot of our Kemetic brothers need to get up on, is that Egyptians, when they heard, they were still worshiping Ra, and they was Hoteps, and they was Osiris and all that kind of stuff. But when people like Pachomius heard the gospel of Jesus Christ, he walked away from that stuff, and he heard the truth of the person who made the sun. He wasn't worshiping the sun no more. He's worshiping the God who made the sun, and his name is Jesus Christ. And wasn't no imperialism. This was before the time of Constantine. Like, wasn't no colonialism. Ain't nobody make these African Christians become Christian. They heard the gospel message. Because these dark brown-skinned Egyptians and North Africans in North Africa heard the gospel from other brown-skinned Jews who came in to Africa and shared the gospel with them, and they believed, and they walked away from their Egyptian religion, and they, in fact, turned their Egyptian temples into churches and started worshiping Jesus Christ up in the Egyptian temples. They walked away from it. Then they went on. They were missionaries. It was Africans evangelizing other Africans. So people want to talk about Europeans brought it together. Yes, they did in the 1400s, but I'm talking about, 1,000 years before that, more than 1,000 years before that. Africans were sharing the gospel with other Africans. Egyptians then went into Nubia, or Kush as it was known then, and began to share the gospel among the Nubians and the Kushites. Then, a little bit because of the missionary effort of Egyptians, Kushites or Nubians became Christian. That's what we now call Sudan. This is one of the most ancient black African kingdoms known to humanity, and Nubia by the 500s became a Christian kingdom of its own desire. And when Islam came in the 600s and conquered Egypt, they tried to come in to Nubia, and the Nubians fought them off. So picture that. You got Arabs who come in from the Arabian Peninsula, and they come in and they bring Islam by force. Now, Christianity did not first come into Africa by force. It came in freely, and Africans heard the gospel on Jesus Christ. Now, Islam, that came in by the sword. That came in through imperialism. The Rashidun Caliphate came in and conquered Egypt, conquered North Africa, destroyed Carthage, and then they tried to go into Nubia, where the black ancient Kushites lived, who were Christians. Picture that. In the 600s, you got warfare going on. You got a major warfare between Arab Muslims that had conquered Egypt coming in, and they were fighting and they were defeated by black Cushitic Nubian Christians, and said, y'all not going to make us be Muslims. We're going to be Christians. We believe in the name of Jesus Christ. And they fought the Muslims off, and Nubia remained a Christian nation for over 1,000 years. And then Ethiopia, same thing. In the year 300s, Ethiopia, the king of Ethiopia, Ezana, he was evangelized by 2 Syrian missionaries. And so again, it didn't come from Europe. It came from 2 Syrian missionaries named Frumentius and Odysseus. And they came from the Syrian area of Phoenicia, and in the Levant, in the early 300s, they shared the gospel with King Ezana. King Ezana, again, freely believed in the gospel. In fact, the missionaries, these 2 Syrian missionaries, were slaves in Egypt. They were shipwrecked as little boys. Then they grew up with King Ezana when he was a boy. They shared the gospel with him, and the king heard the gospel from 2 slaves in Ethiopia, and then he believed in the gospel, and he accepted Christianity as the national religion of Ethiopia. And Ethiopia has been a predominantly Christian country since, the only African country to never have been colonized. Every other nation on the continent of Africa has been colonized, unfortunately. Ethiopia has never been colonized. It is the most, in that way, I like to call it real life Wakanda, because it is a true source of black African pride. There's a reason why Rastafarians love Ethiopia and kind of yearn for it and go back to it. And in fact, even in our school, Meacham, our seminary, we even using Ethiopian words to kind of name our seminary program. And that's that. There's a reason for that, because this is a forever independent black ancient kingdom that has been predominantly Christian. And again, the idea to them that Christianity is a white man's religion is laughable. I mean, is inconceivable to them. They would never even think of that, because they have been a Christian nation. In fact, Portuguese in the 1700s tried to come in and bring European Christianity into Ethiopia. The white folks tried to, as soon as they went to West Africa, they tried to come into East Africa too and try to colonize there too. And they said, "Hey, we've come here to tell you about Jesus Christ." And the Ethiopians said, "Yeah, we've been knowing about him for about over 1,000 years now. Back when y'all was still worshiping, whatever y'all was worshiping."
Oh my goodness, man! That is amazing. I think that's so important, man, for young black men to hear, because I think that's, when it comes to trying to lead, a brother to Christ, that's one of the first things you hear, that it's the white man's religion. I want to wrap it up, but as you're talking, man, and I need to come see you live. But the one thing that I wanted to ask you was, as you're going around, I know you teach, and where do you teach at?
Yeah, so yeah, I work with a seminary program. It's called the Meacham Memhara Hymeno. That means Meacham School of Theology. John and Mary Meacham were abolitionists and black pastors here in St. Louis, Missouri, who were teaching slaves how to read when it was illegal, and also leading them into freedom. And then Memhara Hymeno, it means School of Theology in the ancient Ethiopian language. And what it is this African and African American based seminary education that is biblical, is rooted in in the authority of the Word of God, and it is academic. It's master's level, where we have partnerships with different seminaries where our courses are accepted as graduate level credit, but we offer it in an accessible way. Again, that's predominantly African American and also black from other cultures, professors who are academically credentialed in biblical and theological studies, and students can enroll online or in person in our site here in St. Louis. And so it's called the Meacham Memhara Hymeno, and that's the primary school that I serve at as the mamher, or the professor, which is again Ethiopian word for teacher or professor. And so that's kind of the main thing I do. But you can learn more about it. The website is www.meacham.org. That's MEACHUM.org.
Dope, man. Well, let me ask you this last question. As you're going around and you're teaching, you're speaking, and two of the major statements that I think, there's a lot of things that people walk away from, from these talks, specifically on the history of Christianity, how it's not the white man's religion. One of those statements is that you make it pretty emphatically. Christianity began with a brown-skinned Middle Eastern Palestinian Jew named Jesus. That's a mouthful. And then you talk about how what you just talked about. I mean, we're not talking about Martin Luther, right? We're talking about the hundreds, and the 200s. I mean, we're talking about early church. I mean, right around the corner, early church. How are your students? How are your students and people who are taking in this information? How are they dealing with this? Because to be honest, this is some very weighty stuff. And after you think you've known something for so long, you've grown up in something for so long, you've had an idea of what it's been for so long, and then to actually see the history of it, it's got to be kind of jarring. How are students responding? How is the church responding? Maybe place that you've spoken to. How are people responding to this?
Yeah. I mean, in my experience, man, like both here at Meacham Memhara Hymeno, with our students are mostly African American, as well as some other black students, and we have some other students as well that are from other ethnicities, but it's predominantly black and African American, and man, most of them really just find it very empowering, because I mean that's something that all of us are dealing with and experiencing. I mean, sometimes when I speak, I'll ask people in the crowd, especially if it's a predominantly Christian crowd, black, I'll ask them like, how many of you know somebody or have heard somebody say, something along the lines of, I don't want to be a Christian, or I'm not really messing with Christianity because that's a white man's religion. And like everybody raised their hand, like every black person, every black Christian knows somebody. Sometimes we even have a member in our family. And so this is a crisis that we have. And again, this is just our community. But like I'm saying, man, this is a crisis across. Man, I was teaching at a Native American Christian college in Arizona, and I was teaching these Native American Christians, man, like Christian Native American Bible college students. And man, I even talked to one that straight up said he got thrown out of his tribe. His tribe's elders straight up told him when he became a Christian, they straight up said, "You are no longer a member of our tribe, because you went to that white man's religion that put us on this reservation in the first place." I mean, man, this stuff is real deal for so many people, and not just in our community, but it is in our community, but so many communities, man, like it's crazy. And so it's just, man, it's been such a blessing to share this, because my response usually, man, is people just get, I mean, it's a joy to share this with my culture, my community, with Black folks, but also even to share this with Latinos and Native Americans, Asian, like other, when I share this with so many different cultures, man, it's just usually like an empowering thing where they're like, man, I had no idea. And they just, it's just such an encouragement, a humbling thing to me, man, to see other people like have that same experience that I did when I first went to Egypt. And they're like, man, I had no idea. And because white evangelical Christian church history textbooks, they don't tell that story. And, they only tell the story of the Martin Luthers and of the, all of the Western church history, European church history and all that kind of stuff. And they don't even get to us till much, much later. And they give us like 2 pages in the book. And and so that's usually sometimes where I, get a little bit more pushback. I'm speaking in white seminaries or Christian colleges or churches or whatever, and get a little more pushback and all that. And I'm not really, I don't really care that much, honestly. Like I'm just like, because my thing is like, but even in those contexts, I do get a lot of support and also a lot of positive feedback as well. But whenever the pushback does come, it usually comes in those circles. And I'll tell you, man, the thing that I love the most, man, is engaging our people in our community that are not Christians, man. Because sometimes they'll show up and they'll, the Israelites, the Semitic, the 5% or whatever, they'll show up and, sometimes they get a little hostile and then you got to pray and ask the Lord, help me not go back to my hood ways. And we were just talking about rejecting our culture because sometimes they can take me there, boy, especially some of these Israelites, boy, but a lot of times, most of them actually, man, they'll be respectful and we'll chop it up. And I just loved it, man. I'll never forget, man. I was speaking on this one time at a HBCU, and man, I had a Kemetic brother straight up tell me, he was like, you know what, man, like I wasn't down with Christianity, like I couldn't mess with it, but man, you've been saying some stuff that's new, man. I never heard about none of this stuff, so I'm gonna have to rethink this whole thing, man. And I was just praising God. I was like, that's really why I do this, man. That's really what it's all about. And so it's just having those kind of experiences, man, has just been so humbling and such a blessing, man.
Dr. Bantu, if somebody wanted to contact you and give more information about the college or you personally, maybe come out and speak, is there an email? Is there an Instagram? What's the best way that that they can hit you online?
Oh yeah, man! Like definitely check me out, man. On www.meacham.org. That's MEACHUM.org. Man, check out the website. You can also hit me up as well on my personal email, Vince.Bantu, VINCE.BANTU. Also at Meacham.org, MEACHUM.org, and definitely also hit me up on Facebook, Vince.Bantu. You see me standing in front of an Ethiopian church that I was blessed to go to, and yeah, man, definitely through those different avenues, man. Definitely hit me up, and this is just this is my mission, man. This is my calling, really. So I would love to chop it up with other folks and also with yourself, in other opportunities, man.
Word. All right, man. Well, Dr. Bantu, this has been awesome. I think your calling is amazing. I think it's weighty, and I think it is. I believe you're literally breaking shackles, and really opening Christianity to those that rejected it because they felt it wasn't culturally appropriate for them. So I appreciate your work, man. I definitely pray God's blessings over you and your family. Give a shout out to your wife and kids, man. I saw your beautiful wife and kids on Facebook. Definitely give a shout out to them before we leave.
Hey, baby, mi amorcita Dianita, mi chula. Yeah, my wife. I want to give big ups to my wife Diana and also my babies TT and Naniki. Yeah, big ups to y'all as well.
There it is. Thank you so much, Dr. Bantu. God bless you, man, and I appreciate you.
All right, my brother.
Thanks for listening to the King Talks podcast. You can find out more about King at kingmovement.com. Also, you can subscribe to the podcast on any of your favorite podcast apps or websites. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Peace. We out.
Yeah. I had a dream. I saw black slaves in 2018 pulling them big king with a crown in the middle, looking like tug of war. I guess they forgot the inheritance of the Lord. Dying over streets when God gave him the earth. It's all in the Bible, just do your research. White man's religion, that's just fake news. The cross hit Africa for Europe even knew. This ain't black versus white, this is dark versus light. But racism might distract you from the Christ on sight. So here's the Visine, me and my team. Dark world, but we flipping on a high beam. King cares for the knowledge, I is to inspire. N for the nurture, the G is to grow higher. Jesus lit the match, so we all on fire. You see a crown on the attire, know you looking at a fighter.
My people, my people.